Hi again. I hope you're enjoying the course and starting to get a sense for how VR can fit into your business. Last time we talked about factors you should consider when integrating VR into your business workflow. Today we're going to discuss how to choose the VR strategies that are right for you and give you some examples of the types of things to look for when considering specific VR technologies and vendors. Before we get into choosing VR providers, let's do a quick review of the differences between augmented reality, mixed reality, and virtual reality, so you have the terminology to discuss this with your business stakeholders. Hopefully this will also be helpful when you are inevitably asked by your stakeholders where the industry is placing its bets in the short, medium, and long term. Let's start with AR. AR, or augmented reality, is simply an overlay of digital content onto the real world. Traditionally, the digital content only interacts with the real world in a superficial way, if at all. For example, Pokemon Go is a well-known AR app, where the content, the Pokemon characters, only react to the phone's GPS location and direction. Whether you're standing in front of a bush or in an open field, the character's appearance remains the same. By this definition, AR is of limited use in design today. For example, to show a physical space realistically decorated with virtual furniture, the furniture needs to stay in place as you walk around the real world, and this is where AR is typically struggling. MR, or mixed reality, is really just another term for augmented reality, except that instead of being mostly independent from each other, in MR, the digital content in the physical world can interact realistically. So back to our example. If Pokemon Go were to be upgraded to mixed reality, the characters could do things like hide behind bushes instead of just being painted on top of them. With a mixed reality decorated room, the digital furniture would stay precisely in place as you moved about. It's still early for MR, with most solutions being too imprecise, costly, or complex to be used at commercial scale. But stay tuned. Over the next few years, initiatives like Google's Project Tango, Apple's ARKit, and Microsoft HoloLens are going to continue to push MR towards the mainstream. And that brings us to virtual reality, the focus of this course. Now, VR differs from augmented reality and mixed reality in that it doesn't attempt to blend the virtual and the real. It instead completely replaces the real world with a fully immersive computer-simulated alternative reality. The Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, the Gear VR, and Google Cardboard are all examples of platforms that provide an immersive VR experience. As we've covered in the first lesson, VR is the most mature of the technologies with a rich ecosystem of hardware, software, and tools already available. That, taken together, can deliver significant ROI, particularly in the fields of architecture and design. There are three popular approaches to VR today. The first is room scale or tethered VR, which includes platforms like the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, and the Sony PlayStation VR. The second is mobile VR, or small VR, which includes Samsung Gear VR and Google Daydream on the high end, through to the smartphone you probably already have in your pocket, paired with an inexpensive plastic or cardboard viewer on the mid to low end. Last is browser VR, also known as fish tank VR, which covers any panoramic viewing experience delivered via desktop, tablet, or phone browser without benefit of a headset. Now, each of these approaches has pros and cons from the perspective of everyday business use, and it's on these that we're going to focus next. So room scale VR allows the user to both look around the virtual space as well as physically move around that space in what's known as 6 degrees of freedom. Handheld controllers let the viewer interact with the scene, and because the entire thing has to be driven by a high-powered desktop computer, visual quality tends to be very good. Taken together, this can result in a high sense of immersion, which is just another way of saying that the virtual world can be made to seem very realistic. There are a few drawbacks. A fairly large dedicated space is typically required, and the cable connecting the headset to the computer can be a real tripping hazard. The hardware is expensive and a little finicky to set up and calibrate, making it impractical for taking on the road. Only one person can be in the rig at a time, and it takes some effort to get them strapped in and usually trained up on the controls. This makes presenting to a group a big logistical challenge. Lastly, full room VR has the highest incidence of VR-induced motion sickness. It turns out there are a few better ways to do real presentation than having to hand your client a sick bucket. Next, let's look at mobile VR. Currently, most mobile VR solutions only allow you to look around a scene, but not move into, around, or up and down in that scene. This is what's known as 3 degrees of freedom. This limited motion results in a marginally less immersive experience. On the upside, mobile VR is very cost-effective, needing nothing more than a smartphone and an inexpensive plastic or cardboard headset. There are no wires to get tangled, no training is needed, and motion sickness is very rare. It's also very easy to present to groups, both in person and remotely. One thing to keep in mind, even with mobile VR, headsets are by no means ubiquitous. When you share a VR experience over social media or through your website, not everyone's going to have access to a headset to view it. For these occasions, you should look for a solution that provides a headset-free alternative. At Yulio, we call this the fish tank viewer. Basically, it's a browser experience that lets you navigate a VR scene as a panoramic image on any phone, tablet, or desktop. It's not as immersive as true VR, but it rounds out the viewing options, as well as being a good fallback for people highly prone to motion sickness. So now that you know about the various VR approaches and their pros and cons, it's time to look at the criteria you should consider when selecting specific VR technologies. We're going to look at 3 areas. First is content authoring. Second is the viewing experience. And last is the total cost of ownership. When it comes to authoring, the rule of thumb is the more you can leverage the tools you're already using, the better. As we discussed last time, ideally you want to create VR content leveraging the skills, CAD tools, and processes you already have in place. For example, if a VR solution requires 3D programming or App Store management, it forces you to consider whether or not you have the requisite skills on your team to do this efficiently. The closer your selected VR solution aligns with your existing tool set and workflows, the faster you'll get to positive ROI. When it comes to viewing VR, one of the most common pitfalls is relying too heavily on novelty. Now, in theory, it sounds great. Strap a CEO into a high-performance tethered VR rig, hand them a child's gamepad, then ask them to drive around a scene. In practice, lots of things can go wrong, and any negativity in the viewing experience tends to have a completely outsized impact on their perception of your work. Bottom line, you need to get past novelty. You need to focus your questions around pragmatic everyday use. So let's look at some examples of the questions you should be looking at asking. How are scenes navigated, and how difficult is it for a novice to do that navigation? People may be afraid of looking foolish, particularly in front of their peers. Does each viewer require training before they can use the system? How long does this take? How do you direct the narrative? If someone does get lost, how do you guide them back on track? If your average presentation involves multiple decision makers, as frankly most do, how do you collaborate when only one person at a time can be in the rig? How willing will clients be to come back to your office a second, a third, or a fourth time to see incremental changes in your designs? If someone does start feeling motion sick, what's your fallback? How will clients share your design with their teams when they do get back to their office? Now, once you've invested in creating VR content, you also have to consider how future-proof it's going to be. Remember, headsets are evolving and they're evolving very quickly. Ask how your content is going to work on those next-generation headsets. The last thing you want is to get stuck with the VR equivalent of a Betamax machine. After you've established that a technology meets your needs for content creation and ease of viewing, next you really need to consider cost. More specifically, you need to look at the total cost of ownership to ensure your investment doesn't end up outweighing the return side of the ROI equation. So let's talk about what to look for on the pricing side. Prices and pricing models have not settled since there's really no commoditization in this field yet. This means it's really important that you pay attention to the details. Look for a pricing model that encourages experimentation. If you're constantly worrying about hitting artificial caps, you won't feel comfortable exploring all the possible ways VR might improve your business. The same thing applies for your staff. Look for a model that lets everyone from content creators, sales, and marketing take advantage of the platform in their area. Be sure to consider if the pricing model lets you leverage your investment in multiple ways. For example, does it let you reuse VR content multiple times on multiple channels? In person, over social media, on the web? What you're looking for is maximization of your ROI. The last factor is, of course, hardware costs. A room-scale VR rig costs thousands of dollars for the hardware alone, while the labor cost to set it up and maintain it can quickly raise that total well above the cost of purchase. Good quality plastic mobile VR headsets are often cheap enough to give out freely to clients, while you may want to restrict higher-end headsets in the $100 range to sales and design folks only. You will also need to consider the cost of the phones themselves. You can create a dedicated pool of devices that are for VR use only, or have salespeople use their own devices. Consider options like slightly older models purchased on reseller websites like a Kijiji to control costs. You'll find a summary of a lot of these points in the white paper that's attached to this lesson about choosing a VR solution. In the end, you want something that gives you enough structure to quickly see meaningful returns while not locking you down so much that you can't explore new uses unique to your business. In Lesson 4, you can take a break from the videos. We'll explore some tips for designing with VR in a reference guide, and we'll be back with a video for our final lesson after that.